Hello, everyone. I'm Rex Brynan. I'm one of the designers of We Are Coming Nineveh. It's March 2023 when this video is being recorded. This game has just come out with Nuts Publishing. And so I'm going to tell you a little about both the game and the battle which it depicts. We Are Coming Nineveh, or Nineveh in Arabic, is a tactical or operational level war game about the liberation of West Mosul from the control of Daesh, otherwise known as the Islamic State or ISIS, by the Iraqi security forces between February and July 2017. The game was first developed by Juliette Lemenaz and Harrison Brewer, who at the time were two students in the course that I teach on wargame design at McGill University. And they were later joined by myself and by Brian Train to produce the game, which is now being published. The game is unusual in that it was play tested not only with hobby wargamers, of which I'm one, but also with professional audiences in the military and the intelligence community. It's a low to medium complexity game, about 90 minutes of game length, and I think it has very high replayability. There you can see at the top the design team, Juliette on the left, and she was really the motive force behind this in the beginning, and Harrison there on the right. Appropriately for enough for a game that it's about intense urban combat in Iraq. Juliette went on to do graduate work in Middle East security studies and works in the Middle East. Harrison went on to do graduate work on urban planning. Brian Train, I'm sure, needs no introduction to wargamers, a very gifted and prolific wargame designer who does a lot of work on insurgency, asymmetrical warfare. And I'm a game designer too, but I also teach Middle East politics and have also worked on the policy end on Middle East issues. And at the bottom there, you can see Juliette watching one of the playtests of the game. This was at the Connections UK professional wargaming conference. So these are largely people in the national security community. Indeed, the person who's playing the Iraqi side in that particular game is Phil Parnell, who up until his retirement from the U.S. Navy was at the Pentagon as one of the U.S. military's senior wargamers. The game, as I said, is now available from Nuts Publishing. The date on the website there says March. Arrival was delayed. Retail release is now April 21st, but at the time of recording, you can in fact order it online. So today's presentation is going to be both about the battle and the game. We'll go through both the operational planning that occurs at the very beginning of the game and then the actual tactical war game that is the bulk of the game. Talk about the way in which we've modeled objectives and victory conditions in the game. Some of the other special rules. We'll talk about solo play. There is, at the time of recording of this video, no up-to-date Vassal or Tabletop Simulator module, although a Vassal module will be coming out later in the spring or summer. Some of the pictures are from the prototype because that's what I have the most pictures of. You can see it at the top, but the bottom is the published game. And other pictures will be from the published game. I actually don't have my copy. It's in the mail to me as I record this video, and I must say I'm very excited to get my final published version of the game. So let's talk for a bit about the Battle of Mosul. Mosul is Iraq's second or third largest city, depending on how you count population, and it was captured by Daesh or ISIS in 2014 in a surprising victory against a much larger at that time Iraqi military and police presence. The recapture of the city of Mosul occurred in 2016 to 2017, by which time the Iraqi military had become much more competent. And it was some of the most intense urban fighting since World War II and the Korean War. Resulting in over 20,000 deaths. We've seen some intense urban combat since then in Ukraine and places like Mariupol, but really the recapture of Mosul in 2016, 2017 was World War II levels of intense urban combat. Around 1,000 Iraqi security force deaths, 5 coalition deaths, U.S. and Iranian. Let's just say the international actors which were backing Iraq, perhaps 10,000 Daesh deaths, although it's very hard to say, and perhaps 10,000 civilian deaths, although again, the actual numbers are unclear. We Are Coming Nineveh, which was incidentally the name of the Iraqi military operation, so that's why it's the name of the war game, focuses on the very final part of this battle. That is the liberation of West Mosul, including the densely built old city between February and July 2017. It was the capture of Mosul which was the point at which Daesh declared its global Islamic caliphate, its Islamic state. And therefore, the loss of Mosul was a critical, not only military blow to the movement, but also political and symbolic blow to the movement. And it was followed not that long after by the fall of its capital in Syria, Raqqa. And you can see there the levels of destruction associated with this battle. Here we see the military movements that occurred in 2016, 2017, as the Iraqi security forces regained control of more and more of the broader urban area. The war game depicts the fighting here in West Mosul. And you could see in that inset map in the bottom right, that's more or less the situation when the war game starts. Those 3 green arrows at the bottom reflect where the ISF player will be starting off from. You can also see on both maps what's marked as Mosul city center in the bottom right. That is actually the old medieval city, which is a rabbit warren, a maze of small alleys, tiny roads, walkways, passages, which simply are too small for the most part to get mechanized vehicles into, and so much of that fighting had to occur on foot. Now, the Battle of Mosul is interesting because it's a very interesting combination, and again, you would see this in subsequent fighting in some areas of Ukraine too, although not in most areas of Ukraine. It is a very interesting combination of high-tech and very traditional urban warfare. So there was intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, ISR support from the US-led coalition. There was training, there was air support, there was indirect fire support. Much of this was quite high-tech. Drones, precision-guided munitions, modern artillery systems, sophisticated intelligence collection. That was provided by the US and other coalition allies, such as the British, the French, the Canadians, and others. At the same time, Iran was also supporting Iraq. It trained and equipped some units of the Iraqi security forces, but particularly the Popular Mobilization Force, the volunteer militia, which was an absolutely key part of Iraq's military campaign against Daesh. But for all the importance of international support, whether from the US-led coalition or from Iran, it has to be remembered that the vast bulk of the fighting and dying in this campaign was done by Iraqis and by Iraqi Kurds. In the case of the battle in Mosul, by the Iraqi army, by the counterterrorism service, it's the Iraqi special forces, and by various interior ministry units, both police units and SWAT teams, and the Popular Mobilization Forces. The Kurds didn't play a major role in the battle for Mosul, although they played a major role in the earlier parts of the campaign against Daesh in northern Iraq. And there was an interesting combination of technology, those things like US drones, Daesh innovation, and Daesh was and is a very innovative, irregular, non-state armed combatant. A lot of technology, a lot of innovation, and yet urban fighting techniques that would have been familiar to veterans of Stalingrad. The importance of urban fortification, the way in which terrain was defined by built space, by major thoroughfares that broke up that built space, by the density of building and construction, types of construction, by the ease of infiltration and the fluidity of front lines. So many aspects of the battle, as I say, would have been familiar to veterans of key urban battles in Stalingrad or Berlin or where have you during World War II. There was also a great deal of complex politics to this operation. What is it that defines success? Is it defeating Daesh as quickly as possible? Is it limiting civilian collateral damage? What combination of those things? And we try to build those into the game. Now, the graphic, the image you see here, in fact, is not really from the Battle of Mosul. It's from the movie Mosul, 2020 movie, which is available in most places on Netflix, which is a really, in my view, a really terrific movie. It's filmed entirely in Arabic with English subtitles. It is a fictionalized version of the story of a real Iraqi police unit. And I think it's worth watching, both because I think it's a very good movie, but I think it gives a real sense of what the fighting was like in Mosul in this period. So here we see more images from the fighting. You can see in the top left there why you're not going to be able to get mechanized forces into the old city. Some of the images at the bottom are from the more regular built-up space around the old city. And I'm also going to show you images, not the actual narration, from a British news report at the time of the fighting, the final push into the old city. And these are Iraqi police units. They're so close to their Daesh opponents that they're literally lobbing grenades over the wall into the next compound. That's how close and intense the fighting are. You can see how dangerous it is to go into any kind of open area, and how difficult those open areas are to traverse because you can immediately be shot. You can see the difficulty of getting any kind of vehicle in there, and that's why Iraqi armored units really weren't present in the final stages of the battle. You can see here these police units are risking having to cross the road, and roads are an important disjuncture in urban warfare. Wide roads are dangerous things to cross, and they provide the kind of natural barriers. You'll see them when you see the map. We've used them to define urban space. And because of the difficulty of moving through roads, the preferred way to move is through small alleys or through mouse holing. This is knocking a hole in a wall so that you can get between two compounds, for example. And again, this is classic urban warfare stuff. The importance of snipers, of elevated positions, and so on and so forth. So I think this news report, it's a real news report, gives you a real sense of how intense and difficult that urban fighting was, particularly here in the old city. So let's talk about the game. Having talked about the battle, let's talk about the game. There are, as I briefly mentioned before, two parts to the game. There's what we might call an operational planning part at the beginning of the game, where you decide a number of things, and then you actually play the war game on the map. At the beginning of the game, you're going to decide on key objectives, and you're going to select additional assets and capabilities before you deploy, and then you're going to fight out the battle. So let's talk about those two phases. Let's start with the operational planning phase. And as I said, the first thing you have to do is each player is secretly going to decide on a key objective, whether it's time, how long it takes to complete the operation, whether it's ISF casualties, how many casualties does the Iraqi military and police suffer, or whether it's collateral damage done to the population and the infrastructure of the city of Mosul. Whichever one you emphasize will have more weight when victory points are calculated at the end of the game. Each player will also secretly spend 30 points on additional units and additional capabilities to augment their core forces. For Daesh, that's things like battlefield preparation, tunnels, mines, fortifications, mouse holes, and so forth, as well as additional assets. The Iraqi security force, in addition to being able to get additional assets, can get additional capabilities, indirect fire, air support, drones, ISR platforms, and is also able to conduct the attack in different ways, to attack more quickly than they did, to engage in a flanking attack, to use heliborne insertions and amphibious crossings of the river if they want to. Because of this, each game is going to be rather different, and it's really important at this stage to make sure that your investment in capabilities and assets matches your campaign objectives. So if you, for example, are the Iraqi player and you decided that keeping collateral damage low is an important part of your victory narrative, that you're going to emphasize that politically, that you didn't destroy the city to save it, then probably it's wise to invest in things like humanitarian supports, field hospitals, and so forth, and not in a lot of indirect fire weapons that are going to flatten the city. So you've really got to decide on your objectives and tailor your force and your doctrine and your training and your supports to support the kinds of operational objectives that you've set yourself. Here you see some of the capability cards, and each one you'll see circled there in red has a points value associated to it. Now, if you don't purchase one of these cards, it doesn't mean that there's no coalition air support or mouse holes, for example, in the campaign. It just means you haven't made an extra effort to focus on this. So you will have less effect. It'll otherwise be factored into your regular combat. So let's look at what Daesh has available to it in terms of both its core units, the ones it always has, and then also the additional units it can acquire and its additional capabilities. So it has two forms of regular infantry. It's militia, and it's more highly trained and motivated veterans. It has rumors, which are dummy counters in order to create fog of war. It has various kinds of improvised explosive devices. It could also acquire stay-behind forces, which hide until after the ISF has passed them by, IED factories in order to produce additional IEDs, technicals, child soldiers, mortars, arms caches to resupply its forces, a media center in order to engage in information warfare, additional IEDs. It has lots of capabilities too: makeshift drones, fortifications, tunnel networks, additional training, manpads, snipers, suicide vests, chemical weapons, mouse holes, mines, spy networks, smuggling networks. Of course, it had some of all of these things, but again, you're deciding, what do I want to invest in having more of in order to support my operational plans? On the Iraqi side, what's available? Your core units are drawn from the 9th Armored Division in the Iraqi army. Those are your most powerful units, but they can't enter the old city. The Counterterrorism Service, which is a special operations force, which was absolutely essential in the liberation of West Mosul, and federal police units, both regular police units. You can see the card there, but there's also emergency response division units, which are kind of police SWAT teams. You can get additional army reinforcements, popular mobilization force, militia reinforcements, and then there's a massive number of capabilities you can invest in: additional artillery support, drones, heliborne insertion. A lot of these things are asset type capabilities, but many of them are also training, doctrine, rules of engagement, improved coordination, improved logistics. In other words, the kind of the software side of putting a military campaign together. And you can see on the right the long list of things which are available to the Iraqi player to invest in, to acquire for the battle, in addition to your core units. Here you can see the map. It's an area movement game. The areas depicted on the map are depicted in such a way as to try and keep neighborhoods together and try and keep urban spaces together. As I mentioned before, major roads tend to be a break point, a discontinuity in urban warfare. You can see that there's sort of three, the movement zones are sort of color coded in three ways. Most of the map is that light tan color. That's an urban zone. It has a stacking limit of 3. The old city is in the gray there. It has a stacking limit of 2 because it's so densely built. And Iraqi armor can't enter into the old city. Daesh veterans have an advantage there. And then there's open zones where there's less urban construction, larger stacking limit, and not surprisingly, Iraqi mechanized forces have a particular advantage there. On the left is where we mark the metrics: time, casualties, collateral damage. And you'll also see the major road network marked out in yellow. One of the challenges of the design was that it took 4 months to move through and capture this area, but you can also theoretically drive from the bottom of the map to the top of the map in an hour and a half, depending on the traffic. The game rules allow you to move quickly along the yellow major thoroughfares if they're not blocked by your opponent. So Daesh has to be careful that the Iraqi army can't execute a kind of sweeping flanking maneuver. So it has to have blockages, military forces, IEDs, and so forth to prevent the Iraqi side from exploiting the road network for improved mobility. The tactical battle. So let's say that you've decided on your objectives, you decided on what additional assets and capabilities you want to bring to the fight. How does the tactical battle work? The main part of the war game. It's an I go, you go system. The ISF is going to go first, followed by the Daesh, and then repeat. In each game turn, there's a support phase. That's generally where capabilities such as ISR platforms, air support, indirect fire, or Daesh production units like producing IEDs or arming new militias, that's when that will occur. There's a movement phase. You resolve all your movement, and there's a combat phase, and then it's the other player's turn. I'll talk too about event cards, the headquarters and supply rules, and so forth that we have in the game, but this is a very accessible game. As I say, it's low, medium complexity, and that was deliberate in the design. I think that there's a lot of nuance in the game, but not a lot of unnecessary clutter or difficult rule systems. I'll also talk about how we determine victory at the end of the game. So as you can see there, and these are images from the prototype, not the production version, it's a block game. And you can see on the left why. It's because it provides fog of war. This is from the image on the left. You're looking from the side of the Iraqi commander. You can see what your forces are, but you do not know what all those black blocks are. What kinds of Daesh units are they? Or are they improvised explosive devices? Or perhaps they simply rumors? Which one is the Daesh military commander? Which one might be IED factories, and so on and so forth. So blocks work very well for depicting fog of war. And there are rumors in there, as I mentioned before, which are dummy counters, which add additional fog of war. So intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance can be absolutely vital, particularly on the Iraqi side. You can see in the bottom right, it's one of our playtest games. And you can see the person on the far right there, it's, my colleague Brianna Prosoviet, is grinning. And she's grinning because she just used a drone to identify the location of the Daesh headquarters, the Daesh leader, and then flattened it with an Iraqi helicopter, Iraqi helicopters, therefore severely degrading the command and control on the Daesh side. Brianna, in fact, is a professional war game designer with the Canadian Armed Forces in real life. So let's do some representative movement here. First, we're going to move that yellow counterterrorism service unit in the bottom right. Normally, you move one zone in a turn. So they could advance into Tehran, which is just to the north. However, you'll see there's a headquarters unit next to them. And headquarters units do have the capability to give you some extra movement. Let's say that they give them an extra move, and so that CTS unit moves to, and then it has to stop as soon as it enters a Daesh zone. So it has to stop at this point because there's a Daesh block in there. If that Daesh block turns out to be an improvised explosive device, you immediately resolve it. You roll a dice, see if you do any damage, and then remove the IED. Let's say that it failed to do any damage to the CTS unit. We've also got a 9th Armored Division unit there on the left, and it is adjacent to one of those big thoroughfares, one of those yellow roads. So it can move as far along the road as it wants until it hits an enemy unit. So it can, in fact, move on to any of these zones here until it finally reaches that dice unit at the top. Let's say it decides to go all the way up to that unit. When we get to if it's not an IED, we don't reveal it right away. It's in fact a militia unit. It'll be revealed when we get to combat. We use a rotational system on the blocks, so you'll see that currently that Daesh militia unit needs a 4 or more to inflict damage. So when it gets damaged itself, you'll rotate it so the 5+ is at the top. It'll then need a 5. If it gets damaged again, you rotate it. It'll need a 6+ to inflict damage, and it doesn't have any rotations left after that. You'll see how powerful the Iraqi mechanized forces are, although, of course, they can't go into the old city, which is where Daesh is going to make its final stand. So let's look at combat now. And the defender always shoots first. So that Daesh militia unit will roll first. It needs, as you can see, a 4+ to inflict damage. It rolled a 5. It does damage. In fact, the Iraqi 9th Armored Division units get a saving throw. They can be quite hard to hurt, but let's say it failed that. We've rotated the block over 90 degrees, and instead of needing a 2+, it now needs a 3+ to hit. 9th Armored Division unit then rolls second as the attacker. It rolls a 3. That's also a hit. We rotate the militia block over 1 to indicate that it's damaged. If the zone is not cleared of defending units at the end of combat, the attacker must retreat. Now, elite units, that's the CTS units on the Iraqi side, and the veteran units on the Daesh side, they can do a second round of combat, but if at the end of combat, the attacker has not cleared the zone, they have to retreat. And so what's happened essentially is this 9th Armored Division unit has barreled up the major road. It's run into a Daesh unit. There's been a short, sharp exchange of fire. There's been casualties on both sides. And then the 9th Armored Division unit has had to fall back. Now, you also have event cards in this game, and they contribute a great deal to, I think, narrative engagement and realism without adding a great deal of complexity in terms of rules. There's an event card, let's say that's the top of the deck. It has a 1 on it. That simply means that during the combat phase, not other phases, during the combat phase, if anyone rolls a 1, they're going to trigger that event. So let's say that a 1 was rolled in that combat that we described earlier. You pull the card, and this particular card says fighting devastates Mosul. If combat is currently being resolved in an old city or urban area, add 1 to collateral damage. This is an urban area, so we'd add 1 to collateral damage. If ISF has invested in the humanitarian assistance capability, ignore this card. So had the ISF spent resources on humanitarian assistance to the civilian population, it would have mitigated this collateral damage, but it failed to do so. So event cards, one of the things event cards do is they can generate collateral damage, but there's a lot of other things that event cards do as well. That first card there is one that causes disruption if Iraqi units from different headquarters are in the same zone. There's not enough deconfliction amongst the different commands, although that can be mitigated by having invested in improved coordination. The next 2 cards are kind of tactical vignettes. In the first one, the Iraqi player has the choice of trying to rescue a child caught in the line of fire, but at risk of taking casualties and being disrupted. The other card, a local has offered to guide you. That could speed your movement, but it could also be a Daesh trap. And there's lots of different sort of tactical vignettes in the event cards. The other one is simply a random event. Daesh has mishandled explosives. It's caused an explosion at or near an IED factory if they have one. That's also an important piece of intelligence because it might help the Iraqi player narrow in on the location of any Daesh IED factory. And there's lots and lots of different cards in the game, some of which reflect historical occurrences, some of which reflect the sort of friction of intense operations in an urban area. I said I'd say a little bit about headquarters and supply rules. Both sides have headquarters units. There are 3 on the Iraqi side, 1 for the army, 1 for the CTS, and 1 for the Interior Ministry. There's 1 on the Daesh side, which is the local military leader. And they can essentially do 3 different things in their turn. They can rally, which is removing disruption from units. They can maneuver, as we saw earlier, to give a unit an extra move. And they can provide leadership to allow a unit to reroll a combat die. It's the same for both sides, but you only have a limited number of orders. You can see there that those are, again, rotation blocks. The most orders you can have saved up is 3. Every time you use a special order, you increment down by 1, and you only get 1 back per turn. So you've got to be careful about when you're going to use them. There are supply rules. The ISF essentially has to trace supply back to those 3 eagles at the bottom of the map. That affects some of their commands and some of their capabilities, but it's actually rather hard for the ISF to lose supply unless they get cut off by badly planning military operations or possibly by certain Daesh capabilities like stay-behind forces. For Daesh, supply is somewhat precarious. As you may remember from the map we saw earlier, at the time of the battle for the old city, Daesh controlled the river up to the north. So if it can maintain communications to those sort of red zones at the top, they're assumed to have lines of communications open to Daesh forces to the northwest. If the ISF can cut those off, it'll affect the ability to use their so-called production units like IED factories, and it'll also begin to cause attrition in militia and Ashbal units as they frankly run away, hide, try and get out of the battle, escape. Victory. To determine victory points, you add together time, casualties, and collateral damage. And you add it in again if it was deemed a priority objective by one of the sides. So if I was Daesh and I decided that collateral damage was my key objective, you would add in collateral damage twice. If the Iraqis decided that casualties were their critical concern, you'd add that in twice. So you add together those things, you add them in again if they were critical objectives, and you can consult the chart to see if you've won. However, there's also built into the rules possibility for arguing as to who won, because the narrative of who won in Mosul is still contested. Now, clearly, Daesh was defeated in a narrow military sense. The Iraqi security forces regained control of the city, and Daesh took heavy casualties. But Daesh is also able to argue, we're not dead yet. The city is in ruins. The population is unhappy. We lasted longer than expected. We inflicted more casualties than expected. We are heroic martyrs of the Islamic State. So the rules do have a provision that if you do really, really well on one of the metrics, for example, in this case, perhaps the Iraqis took extremely heavy casualties, much higher than historically was the case, then Daesh can argue they've won regardless of what the victory points add up to. So there is the possibility of an ambiguous victory, but most games it will be clear who won. There is a solo play mechanic. You can play as the ISF against the game. You can't play solo as Daesh. There's no Daesh operational planning. There's randomized but sensible deployment. They don't invest in capabilities. Instead, each turn you're going to draw a military council card to find out what Daesh does. And that will bring in capabilities, that will bring in tactical actions, and so on and so forth. So that is the battle, and that is the game. I hope you get a chance to play it sometime. I hope perhaps if you're very interested, you might decide to order a copy. So I'm Rex Brynan on behalf of my co-designers and Nuts Publishing. Thank you for listening to this presentation, and I very much hope that you'll get a chance to play and enjoy We Are Coming, Nineveh.